Canada is making a bold move that could change the future of North American trade. As important talks continue behind closed doors, Canada could gain more power, stronger industries, and greater control over its economy. But for the US, this shift may mean losing influence it once enjoyed. What happens next could surprise the world. 21 days. That is what remains before Canada, the United States, and Mexico open the first mandatory review of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement on July 1st, 2026, a review that determines whether the trade framework governing nearly $2 trillion in annual North American trade gets extended for another 16 years or enters a holding pattern of annual reviews that could ultimately lead to expiration in 2036. Formal review talks between Washington and Ottawa have not yet officially launched. The clock did not stop. It kept running. Canada's position is on the record and has been since trade negotiations resumed in March 2026, after a 5-month breakdown that began in October 2025. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc delivered a formal written request to American and Mexican counterparts seeking a full 16-year renewal, the maximum extension period CUSMA's review clause permits. Canada's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, appointed by Carney, described July 1st as a checkpoint rather than a cliff language chosen to convey that the date does not terminate the agreement, while simultaneously acknowledging that the checkpoint is approaching without the consensus a clean renewal requires. Washington's position complicates that request in 3 specific areas, each of which converts what Ottawa hoped would be a procedural renewal into a substantive negotiation. The first is automotive content rules. The American proposal presented on May 29th, 2026, demands that vehicles contain at least 82.5% North American content, up from the current 75%, with at least 50% of that content specifically manufactured in the United States. The current framework measures regional content cumulatively, treating Canadian assembled components and American assembled components as equivalent toward the regional total. The proposed US-specific floor breaks that equivalence, penalizing Canadian assembled content relative to American assembled content within the same vehicle. The second area is stronger US manufacturing requirements more broadly, extending beyond automobiles into the Section 232 tariff structure, covering steel, aluminum, copper, and forest products that currently sit entirely outside CUSMA's formal framework. Carney addressed this directly, but for us, there's the more fundamental structural issues, as people know, which relate to the so-called strategic sectors. That's the American term. The 232 tariffs that are on automobiles, on steel, aluminum, forest products particularly. We're looking to determine whether there's a possibility of a new partnership there. A CUSMA renewal that leaves the Section 232 tariffs untouched does not resolve the trade conflict that has been damaging Canadian exporters since 2025. It simply renews the agreement's framework while the tariffs operating outside that framework continue. The third area is dairy market access, the longest-standing irritant in the bilateral relationship, predating even the original NAFTA negotiations of the early 1990s. Canada's supply management system sets production quotas for dairy and poultry through provincial marketing boards, a structure that survived NAFTA, survived CUSMA's original negotiation in 2018-2020, and remains explicitly outside the internal trade liberalization Canada completed domestically in June 2025. The 2026 U.S. Trade Representative's National Trade Estimate Report lists Canada's dairy supply management system as an active bilateral irritant. American demands for increased access to Canada's dairy market in the current review revisit a fight that every Canadian government since the original Mulroney-era free trade negotiations has treated as politically untouchable. Supply management enjoys cross-party protection in Canadian politics because of its concentration in Quebec and Ontario dairy-producing ridings. U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra characterized the negotiating environment in March 2026 by acknowledging that talks are facing headwinds. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer told the House Ways and Means Committee in April 2026 that Canada and the United States have models that don't fit together very well, describing Canada as doubling down on globalization when we're trying to correct for problems of globalization. Greer also stated that US-Mexico talks are progressing faster than US-Canada talks, a specific signal that the trilateral structure of CUSMA may be experiencing different negotiating dynamics with each bilateral partner, raising the question of whether a two-track outcome, with Mexico advancing toward resolution faster than Canada, becomes a feature of the July 1st checkpoint. The economic modeling Canadian institutions have built around the possible outcomes is specific and quantified. The Bank of Canada's January 2026 Monetary Policy Report assumes ongoing trade policy uncertainty as part of its baseline economic projection, meaning the central bank's own growth and inflation forecasts. Already price in a degree of unresolved CUSMA uncertainty extending past July 1st. Even under the base case scenario that major financial institutions are modeling extension with amendments Canadian real GDP growth forecasts for 2026 cluster around 1.1 to 1.5%, well below trend, because an amended CUSMA extension does not automatically remove the Section 232 tariffs operating outside its framework. Trade Minister LeBlanc has been explicit about the procedural reality if consensus is not reached by July 1st. If there's not consensus in the review, the agreement continues on. Then there's an annual review that starts. And if uncertainty is one of the objectives from one of our CUSMA partners, you can imagine scenarios of how this might go. That scenario, termed zombie USMCA by analysts, does not terminate the agreement. It places it into a state where 89% of Canadian exports currently qualifying for CUSMA-compliant tariff treatment continue operating under the existing framework, while the absence of a long-term renewal commitment means every annual review cycle becomes a fresh negotiation with fresh uncertainty. The Eurasia Group ranked this annual review scenario 9th on its top 10 global risks for 2026. Barry Appleton of the Center for International Law at New York Law School framed the core danger precisely. The principal risk is not that CUSMA terminates in 2026, but that it functions as though it might indefinitely. The withdrawal scenario, while less probable according to most analysts, carries the most severe modeled outcomes. Under Article 34.6, any party can withdraw from CUSMA with 6 months written notice, with the agreement remaining in force between the remaining parties. Scotiabank's March 2026 scenario analysis modeled a disruptive but contained outcome. CUSMA negotiations collapse and the US imposes 10% tariffs on currently exempt Canadian goods, producing a 0.6% contraction in real Canadian GDP within a year and unemployment rising to 6.5%. A severe scenario involving 35% tariffs on currently exempt goods produces a 1.9% GDP contraction, 7.1% unemployment, and a roughly 4% decline in export volumes within a year. Ontario carries the most concentrated exposure to any of these outcomes. 81% of Ontario's goods exports go to the United States, and 42% of jobs created through Canada-US trade are concentrated in the province. Ontario's 2026 provincial budget separately modeled a CUSMA withdrawal scenario, assuming 12% US tariffs. Provincial GDP growth slows from a projected 1.0% to 0.3% in 2026, recovering only to 0.6% in 2027. 21 days remain. The automotive content proposal is on the table. The Section 232 tariffs sit outside the formal review process entirely. Dairy market access, the irritant that has survived every previous renegotiation untouched, is back in American demands. Canada has submitted its written request for a 16-year extension. The United States has indicated talks may not conclude by July 1st. And the Bank of Canada's own economic projections are already built around the assumption that none of this resolves cleanly on schedule.